to send a procedural note to all the caucuses, reminding them of this fact. And like he has done that before in the past and will continue to do that. So I will ask him to do that to remind all members that that is the procedure. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was not aware of that ruling, or I would have paraphrased the communication or something like that. So please be rest assured that in the future I will fully comply.
Thank you, and that's why I'll have my Chief Kirk send out a procedural note, like he continues to do, to make sure that everybody is aware of the procedures and the policies in the floor of the legislature. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my distinct pleasure to rise and speak on this bill tonight. I can't help but note that we are talking about one of the most fundamental and basic principles of our democratic system, that is the rules around which people are granted their franchise, the privilege of voting in an election, and the rules that we put in place to assure all Nova Scotians that when they take the time and effort to determine who they're going to cast their ballot for, how they're going to exercise their franchise, and when they go and do exactly that, Mr. Speaker, that they have rules in place that are fair and impartial and based on sound democratic principles. It's, of course, appropriate that those rules be updated and modernized from time to time to keep pace with the ever-changing nature of our society. I say that recognizing that we are, in fact, here in this chamber in Halifax at the very home of responsible government in our country and in our Commonwealth and around the world. Nova Scotia was a leader all those years ago, more than 250 years ago, in modernizing its system of government to ensure that it was democratic, that the people's voices were heard, that people chose their government in a fair and impartial way. And we've lived by those principles ever since. Even though that behind those principles, the rules of the game may change from time to time in order to keep pace with technology or with a modernizing society, with a society that communicates at a faster pace, with a society that has grown in wealth, and in a society where the distribution of wealth has changed dramatically. It's important and appropriate that our rules be updated from time to time to reflect that. But, Mr. Speaker, I am using the term responsible government particularly because I think it's fair to say that although the term responsible government has a very specific meaning in our parliamentary system, that Nova Scotians would apply other meanings to the word responsible government. The exact meaning, of course, in parliamentary tradition is that a responsible government is one that is responsible to its electors through the legislature. In other words, the Premier and his ministers, his or her ministers, are drawn from the legislature and are therefore responsible to the House of Assembly. That's what responsible government means. But I say this because when Nova Scotians talk about a responsible government, they mean that, but they also mean a government that does its homework, a government that doesn't put forward legislation until it has gone through the appropriate steps of consultation, of examination, of looking at best practices around the country and around the world and so on. And although this government may meet the first test in that the Premier and Cabinet are responsible to the legislature in the traditional sense, here again we have a bill where they are not responsible in the way that most Nova Scotians consider the word responsible. They haven't, yet again, done their homework. It's shocking, Mr. Speaker, because I'll contrast them to a group of electors who I believe did do their homework at a higher level than this government has done. And I'm referring to Mr. Kane's grade 5 class at my 11-year-old daughter's school, because they had an election project in line with the federal election that we just all went through. And they had to study all of the parties, and they had to determine which platforms, which candidates most closely respected their views, keeping in mind that they are 11 years old. And they did research, and they wrote papers, and they debated amongst themselves, and they came to their decision on May the 2nd, and they cast their ballots in secret, and then those ballots were counted in a fair and impartial manner by the teacher. What could be more fair or impartial than that? I don't think it's a coincidence that the Conservatives actually won that election in Mr. Kane's grade 5 class, because after all, look at all the research that they had done and the homework that they had done. It only seems appropriate that they'd come to such a logical conclusion for their country. But that is unfortunately a very sad contrast to the work that's gone into this bill. Because it was 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, that this House passed a resolution empowering the Chief Electoral Office to go about an examination of all of the issues that would be involved in producing a modernized Elections Act for our province. And it has been a long time since this exercise has been done, and society has changed a lot since this was last done more than 25 years ago. We have Twitter, and we have Facebook, we have blogging and email, and we have the internet generally is now a tool of communication. In fact, in my house, my kids think that email is old-fashioned, and it wasn't even in use when the Election Act was last faced with a thorough revision. So society continues to evolve, and so too do the rules of democracy need to evolve to keep up with it. But, Mr. Speaker, as the rules evolve to keep track of a fast-paced, ever-changing society, the basic principles that underline those rules, they do not need to change. The basic principle that Nova Scotians should cast their vote in secret, that every Nova Scotian, regardless of their mobility, regardless of their income, regardless of their geography, should have easy and fair access to a polling station, that every Nova Scotian should be on the list of electors, that every Nova Scotian should be able to get to a polling station and all the way from the front door of that polling station through to the ballot box and back without restriction is a principle that is timeless, that has existed since Confederation itself and will continue to exist well into the future regardless of what technology might come and go in the meantime. Or the idea that when the time comes for a writ or a series of writs to be dropped and Nova Scotians to be asked for their opinion on who it is that should form the government, that they should be able to make those decisions without undue influence, without someone shouting in their ear, particularly if that someone just has a larger bullhorn than everybody else or more money to spend than anyone else. There are, in fact, too many examples in our past, both as a province and as a country, where that kind of unfair influence has been brought to bear in an election. And I'm going to deal with that in a moment. But I do want to just complete my theme about how the government has not acted responsibly, because in the last 2 years, the Electoral Commission has gone about doing its work in response to a resolution of this House. It has used the Electoral Commission itself, which has equal representation from all parties, to draw opinions from the political parties on what provisions need to be modernized. And I know that every party in this House has representatives on that commission, and that they have done their work as political parties to provide that information to the government for it to consider when drafting this bill. Further, I know that all parties have engaged their own experts, volunteer or otherwise, to provide information to the Electoral Commission on amendments that need to be made to the Elections Act. And I know that the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer has drawn widely on the expertise of political scientists and other informed Nova Scotians about what amendments are appropriate as we modernize the Elections Act. All of that was done, and a whole host of suggested amendments came forward, many of which are in this bill, but mysteriously not all. In addition, Mr. Speaker, other parties on this side of the House have brought forward their own bills or amendments or suggestions to improve our political process. I know that the Liberal Party has done that on occasion. I'll leave it to them to describe theirs, but I will point out that on April 1st of this year, well over a month ago, 5 weeks ago, almost 6 weeks ago, our party introduced the Modernizing Government Act, which had some very specific provisions to update the electoral process based on important principles to make our electoral process more open and more accessible and more fair and more equitable and more meaningful to Nova Scotians, to speak specifically to the too many people who have grown cynical and distrustful of our political process, who have turned their backs on it in disgust, who we need to turn around and come back in if we're ever going to move forward as a province, if we're ever going to face and tackle and win and overcome the great challenges that we face and take advantage of the great opportunities that we have. We need an engaged citizenry. And so the time for playing games is over. The time to cherry pick amendments that are favorable to your party and not to the other parties is over. When all of that body of work was done, it included some very good ideas on access, on polling days, and so on. But it also included some very specific recommendations around third-party advertising. So I will say that the government has at least picked up on some of the other items, some of the things that have been suggested. In the case of our own Modernizing Government Act, we proposed that there be a disabled person who is part of the Electoral Commission so that they can look at the rules and procedures that the Commission puts out to polling stations in districts to ensure accessibility with the eye of someone who is disabled or has mobility issues. Because on paper, you may feel that you have proposed a regulation that ensures accessibility. But until you have been there yourself, you cannot be assured that that is the case. And so, for example, Mr. Speaker, you can have a regulation that all polling stations must be wheelchair accessible. There must be a ramp to get you from street level up to the front door of a building that houses a polling station. And that is, in fact, a regulation. But too many Nova Scotians have attempted to enter a polling station that does have a ramp, only to get to the top of the ramp and find that they can't get in the building. Perhaps there is too great a lip between the top of the ramp and the bottom of the doorway. This happens because there's no regulation specifically about that. Or they get to the top of the ramp and the door opens the wrong way. And so as you're at the top of the ramp in a wheelchair, you can't open the door and enter, thus defeating the purpose of having an accessibility regulation. Or the regulation provides accessibility to get you in the front door, but provides nothing to get you from the front door to the polling booth, which defeats the whole purpose. These are things that can be addressed. These are issues that can be identified if the Electoral Commission has a person of disability on the Commission or as a non-voting member of the Commission, if that's where the government wished to go, but have them there. So this particular bill takes a small step in the right direction by requiring that the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer consult with a disabled person when drafting regulations. It's not everything that we had proposed. I believe that our Modernizing Government Act provisions in this area were much more effective at ensuring the ultimate goal, which is that there be full and fair and free access to the polling box, to the ballot box itself, by all Nova Scotians, regardless of their mobility. And so I hope the government eventually moves in that direction. But I do want to recognize that at least this particular Elections Act takes a small step forward in that way. The Elections Act also has some provisions about public opinion polling and the publishing of the results of public opinion polling. This is, of course, an attempt by the government to keep up with modern times. The Act requires that polls must, when published, provide the sample size and the margin of error and the sponsor of the poll so that Nova Scotians, in reading a poll, can know those things, which it's important for them to know when making up their mind how much weight to put on that particular poll. However, Mr. Speaker, technology is already moving on beyond the traditional public opinion polls, the telephone-based public opinion polls, where you can calculate margins of error and sample sizes and confidence levels. Many public opinion research firms are now moving past telephone-based polls because they're getting harder and harder to complete and moving to online panels. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, online panels don't have margins of error, and they don't have confidence levels. They don't truly have sample sizes. The math doesn't work that way for them. But yet they're published in the media side by side with traditional polls and given equal weight. If the government had done its homework appropriately, they would know this and have provided some provision for the publishing of online panels as a result. In fact, in the last provincial election, in the middle of the election campaign itself, there was published, to great fanfare, a poll which was in fact an online panel. Now, it was favorable to the NDP, but it was a big wake-up call that there's a whole new field of research now. Now, that was 2 years ago. That grade 5 class, Mr. Kane's grade 5 class, would have uncovered this in the research and made sure that their bill to modernize the Elections Act at least brought it up to today, not to 50 years ago. But by these particular provisions on polling, although in the NDP's view, I guess it's modernizing up to the way things were 50 years ago. That's not modern enough in the views of anyone who thinks about it for a moment. So I hope that the government considers the effect of online panels, which are now becoming more widely used in public opinion research, and ensure that there is appropriate regulation of online panels. But my main point tonight, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I should say, Madam Speaker, is that all of the data, all of the feedback from all of the parties, from all of the political science professors, from all of the Nova Scotians that were consulted, was compiled in the report of the Chief Electoral Officer, which was then published and presented to this House. Many of the items in the report are in the Elections Act, but third-party advertising limits are not in the Elections Act. A glaring omission. An omission that actually ignores the collective wisdom of all of these people who participated in the process of contributing to the modernizing of the Elections Act over the last number of years, including our political scientists, including volunteers and supporters of all three political parties, including the members of the Electoral Commission itself, and including the Chief Electoral Officer, who wrote extensively about third-party advertising in her report. In fact, if I could quote the report for just a moment, from page 6, not very far into the report, I might add, that for those that don't like to read more than a few pages, you only have to reach page 6 to get to the section on third-party regulation, and I quote from the report, "There is increasing recognition by both legislators and the public that organizations apart from parties and candidates undertake activities, particularly with respect to advertising, that have the potential to influence how electors vote during an election. Additionally, these third parties may solicit contributions to fund those activities in a manner similar to the solicitation of political contributions by parties and candidates." It's a very true statement, Madam Speaker, and it's on page 6 of the report. I wish that the senior members of the government who were responsible for introducing the Elections Act had bothered to read the report at least to page 6, because maybe the Elections Act would have contained appropriate provisions in this area. Or, if that's not really the reason, because it is kind of incredible to think that the reason there was nothing on third-party advertising is because the senior officials responsible on the government side didn't read that far in their own report. Oh, if that's not the case, then it's a glaring omission. It's a glaring omission that defies common sense to have set as a goal to modernize our election laws and have nothing to say about third-party advertising. It's not only a slap in the face to all of those who participated openly in the process, it's just a glaring omission that is contemptuous of our political history. You know, Madam Speaker, there are many examples, both in our country and our province, where we have had elections where the influence of third parties has been felt overly much. I shouldn't need to remind the members on the government side, the NDP members of the 1988 federal election, the free trade election, but it is a great example of what I'm talking about. Many members of this House and others present will recall that Canada went through a very dramatic election in 1988 where the government had proposed a free trade agreement with the United States, and then the opposition parties in the House of Commons in Ottawa opposed that agreement. So Canadians heard from both the governing party and the opposition parties at that time in a general election largely fought around this one issue. But the fact of the matter is, Madam Speaker, that Canadians will also recall that the business community of that time had a lot to say about the free trade agreement and spent heavily advertising its promotion, including multiple full-page color ads in all of our national newspapers and local newspapers and television ads. They spent millions and millions and millions of dollars. On the other hand, the national labor unions of the time, having a different view, also collected up the dues of their members and spent heavily against the free trade agreement. Now, in the interest of fairness, I'm talking about both sides, because at the end of the day, both had a special interest in the outcome. And what's a shame about that, Madam Speaker, is that when that happens, Canadians are left wondering, well, who was out there talking about the general interest? Never mind the special interest. Who is it in our system that stands up for the people, for the general interest? And the ultimate answer to that question should be our political parties and their leaders, but our parties more generally. They are the ones that get elected. They are the ones that have to weigh and balance all of the interests in our society and do what's in the best interests of the general public. That is one of the most fundamental purposes of a political party. For the country as a whole, political parties are the place where people from across the country who hold a common view can come together in a united way. Francophone, Anglophone, Western, Eastern, Atlantic, richer, poorer, labor, management. Political parties bring them all together and forge a great common consensus that is not beholden to any one special interest. At least this is the ideal. They're there for the general interest. But in that free trade election, the general interest and the special interest all got mushed together because third-party advertising played such a gigantic role during the election campaign in the great national debate. For those that remember that election, they'll also remember that the Public Service Alliance of Canada spent heavily in targeted ridings trying to defeat members of the governing party. So this is a very specific political objective. Not even a high-minded ideal like free trade or not, but just a pure political play to take out members of a particular political party. That the Public Service Alliance of Canada, not happy with the wage settlements that had been negotiated during that particular government's time in office, not happy with the labor agenda of that particular government, identified a number of government members across the country, one of which was in Halifax, this is why this is particularly interested, and sent paid workers in and took out heavily expensive paid advertisements to defeat those individuals. A pure political play based on a special interest. And the great crime in all that, if I could use the riding of Halifax as an example, is that in Halifax, it was not left just to the electors of Halifax to choose who their representative was. They had to be subjected to a great deal of noise and color and expense by a special interest that did not have as its core what was best for the federal riding of Halifax. It had its own political interest. And because there was no regulation in this area, they didn't have to identify who the sponsors of their ads were. They didn't have to disclose how much they were spending in Halifax. They didn't have to explain what their special interest was. They could advertise without limit, even beyond what the parties themselves are allowed to spend. And certainly when a political party runs an ad, appropriately, it must identify that the ad has been authorized by that party so that electors can judge for themselves the merits of the claims made in elections ads. That was the election of 1988. But let me give you another example. Let's go back further in our history. Some members, not me, but some, not the member for Bedford Birch Cove, because she's too young to remember as well, but some members will remember, or other members, will remember the great Medicare debate of the 1960s. First in the province of Saskatchewan, and then later for our country as a whole. This turns out now, Medicare, to be one of the great shining achievements of our country, something that Canadians, regardless of political party, are very proud of. But we don't remember how hard it was at the time to get it through. First in Saskatchewan, and then later in every province across the country. In the first election in Saskatchewan, an NDP government, might as well be accurate in describing history, brought in a Medicare and subjected it to a provincial election. But there were a lot of special interests, including the Medical Society, who were against it and spent heavily in advertising, in work, in 100 ways to try and defeat Medicare. Now imagine if they had succeeded. Imagine how unfair it is that there was no one outside of the political parties on the other side organized to promote the benefits of a universal, accessible, publicly funded healthcare system. Now, fortunately, the electors in Saskatchewan saw through all the special interests and saw fit to return the government. This same thing happened in Nova Scotia, Madam Speaker. I am quite proud of the fact that Medicare was brought in to our province by a progressive conservative government in 1967. And I think it is a great achievement of our province, as well as all other provinces. But it wasn't easy even here, as there were a lot of special interests out to defeat Medicare in its infancy, even in Nova Scotia, who had the ability to spend without limit, without identifying their own special interests, without registering as a third party. Without those rules in place, accomplishments like Medicare are very hard to achieve and very rare. Well, let me give you another example. Madam Speaker, many members, this is a more recent one, will remember the national referendum we had on the Constitution in 1992, the Charlottetown Accord. There was heavy spending on all sides by corporate Canada and others, pro and con. One of the most fundamental questions of that time, Quebec's role in Canada, whether Quebec is a distinct society or not, what is the role for Aboriginals in our First Ministers' meetings and so on, Aboriginal Canadians. This was at the heart of the Charlottetown Accord. And this was given to Canadians to pass judgment on. And one can only wonder what that debate would have looked like if it had been free of all the special interests, to allow Canadians to decide in the general interest, for their country, what is best for their country. Free and clear of all of that interference. To hear directly from their political leaders without others cluttering up the message. That is what democracy is supposed to be all about. And of course, Mr. Speaker or Madam Speaker, and I don't raise this to be overly partisan, but even in our most recent 2009 provincial election, we saw the heavy hand of unrestricted third parties trying to weasel their way through the electoral laws on financial contributions by pooling their resources through the Building Trades Council to make sure they got as much money as they could to their favorite political party, the NDP. This has resulted in a scandal that continues to reverberate to this day. And it's only because the statute of limitations has come and gone that we haven't seen charges laid in this case, Madam Speaker. And it's a shame that Nova Scotians have that stain on their own record from the 2009 election that goes uncleansed. And here we are with a chance to deal with these kinds of things again, since we have as a stated goal to modernize the Elections Act. But given that opportunity, the government remains silent. And it's a shame, because no one could conclude that the government has left third-party advertising out of this bill because of any high-minded principle. Because every high-minded principle in our system would point exactly in the opposite direction, that Nova Scotians should determine who their government is, free and clear of outside influence. That for all those years between elections, they hear from all the special interests. In fact, I think Nova Scotians know in their gut that there are lots of well-funded special interests that pay lobbyists to come here to the legislature in Halifax to speak to members of the government, to speak to individual MLAs, that their voice gets heard. But for that everyday family, for that ordinary Nova Scotian who's just working hard and trying to make ends meet, pay the mortgage, pay the heating bill, drive the car back and forth to work, send the kids to school, save for a dignified retirement, they don't have a lobbyist. They don't go out and hire a lobbyist to come to Halifax and speak for them. And God help us, nor should they have to do that. Because the person that they should look to, the person they should hear from, the person they should be able to speak to directly and clearly in our system, in our province, is their MLA. That is their lobbyist. That is our number one job. That is what we were sent here to this chamber to do, is to be the one group, the one person in your constituency who is free of special interests, who has only the general interest at heart. And when we debate bills, whether they're on the Elections Act or anything else, that we can tell them and they can see for themselves that they don't need a lobbyist like big unions and big corporations do, because they have their MLA directly. Now, I can hear thousands of eyeballs rolling back across the province as I say this, because people have become so cynical about our system. But this I believe to be true. This needs to be true again in our province. Just like 250 years ago here, this was the place that restored democracy to British North America, that brought democracy to British North America. This can be the place again, where all those people that have turned their backs and said, oh, that might be the way it's supposed to be, but that's not the way it is. Things like this Elections Act, this bill, are our chance to show them that they don't need to turn their back, that they can come back in. We're not going to get them all the way there with one simple bill. Too much damage has been done over the years to do that. I'm realistic enough to understand that. But this is a chance to take a step in the right direction. But it's not going to happen when the government brings forward a bill that cherry picks only items that are favorable to them and their party. and is silent on something so important and so fundamental as a matter of principle as whether or not there should be limits on the ability of third parties, organizations that don't put a name on the ballot, organizations that have no fiduciary duty to an elector somewhere in the province, organizations that have a very special interest, whether it's a shareholder or a union member or some other group other than the people themselves, that the government would bring forward a bill that is silent on this problem is unfathomable, Madam Speaker, and unconscionable, because we don't get to do this very often, nor should we have to do it very often. How sad is it that the government introduces a bill, calls it for second reading on a Friday, and then goes home for the weekend and comes back Monday and says, oops, I forgot something. That is what we're supposed to take from the government's statements today. Oops, we forgot this whole section starting on page 6. Maybe we'll bring forward an amendment to clean that up. That is not doing your homework like Nova Scotians would expect homework to be done. It doesn't even meet the test of Mr. Kane's grade 5 class. He would give the government a failing grade for not having done their homework, even though it's all there for the government to see, to read, to study, to take up, to convert into an actual bill, even though they have all of the officials of government at their disposal to make sure these things happen. That is why it is so incredible, Madam Speaker, to hear that we're supposed to take this oops as the way it is. But the alternative explanation is even worse, that it wasn't an oops, that in fact the government full well read the entire report, including third-party regulation on page 6, including the input that it asked for from all of those Nova Scotians who care about our system and provided input on how it can be modernized. This is even worse than an oops, when the government cherry-picks favorable changes and ignores the rest. That is a greater problem that we have in our system. Perhaps, Madam Speaker, it is the greatest argument of all for why we need an independent chief electoral office, one that is required to report to all parties through this House of Assembly, because we cannot count on this government, even on the rules of elections, to be fair and balanced and impartial. That is why, Madam Speaker, that on the issue of third-party advertising, in our own bill, the Modernizing Government Act, we specifically require that all third parties register with the Chief Electoral Office, that all third parties that propose to spend more than $500 in our province on advertising be required to register with the office, and that they disclose in any advertising the sponsor of that advertising, and that their spending be limited, and limited in a way that is relevant to Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia political parties have spending limits, and appropriately so. But third-party advertisers should have spending limits, and they should be very low. Now, the Supreme Court correctly points out that we do have the right to free speech, both as individuals and as organizations, and so the limit ought not to be zero. I'm not advocating that it be zero. That would violate our constitutional rights around free speech. On the other hand, there is a democratic principle that at election time, Nova Scotians should hear directly from their MLA, from their political parties, that the conversation should be limited almost exclusively to a discussion between the voters and their political representatives for the greater good, for the general interest, so that when Nova Scotians cast their ballot, they'll do so with the greatest clarity about what the parties stand for, what the candidates and their constituency stand for, and so they can make their best possible choice. That should be the aim of this bill, but it's not when it leaves third parties unfettered to spend as they please, without registration, without limit, to try and influence the votes of Nova Scotians in a special interest as opposed to the general interest. And so we proposed in our bill a very modest limit for third parties, 1 1/3% of that limit that applies to the parties themselves, recognized political parties, ensuring that primarily in an election that the discussion is between the parties and the voters themselves, ensuring that there is a proportionate relationship between what parties can spend and what third parties can spend, ensuring that that limit is in place as a matter of principle for all time, never mind inflation, never mind changes in technology, never mind changes in net wealth in our province, that relationship, that 1 1/3%, can remain in place as a matter of principle. Now, I hear the government is looking at the federal rules, which, as a matter of interest, are fixed dollar limits, $150,000 for the country on third-party advertising limit. Well, that is a ridiculous amount to propose for a small Nova Scotia. So I'm hopeful that when the government brings forward an amendment, it'll be something that reflects the reality of the size of Nova Scotia. But we already proposed this a month ago in our own bill, not as a fixed dollar amount, but as a percentage of what the provincial parties can spend, so that that principle can be maintained. And I might point out, Madam Speaker, that of course these limits only apply during the writ period or during the election period itself. That is because we don't have fixed dates of election in our province, and so there's no way to regulate the amount of third-party spending that might go on prior to an election, because only the Premier knows when the next election is going to be, if he knows. Only he has the ability to set that date. That, of course, is the old way. That, of course, confers a tremendous advantage on the government of the day. Now imagine that you match that advantage up with the benefits of third-party advertising. When you have a government as specifically and wholly beholden to special interests as we now have in Nova Scotia, that possibility is no longer theoretical. It becomes a very real threat. And you can just imagine, Madam Speaker, as all Nova Scotians can imagine, what happens behind closed doors when a representative of that government and a special interest get together to plot out their combined strategy, unlimited spending, and the timing of an election to their mutual advantage. Who is left out of that discussion, by the way? It is the people themselves. It is the voters in an election, the very people that we all want to have free and unfettered discussions with their political parties. And that's why, Madam Speaker, that it's not enough to just limit third-party advertising during a general election, because that would leave those third parties a sky's the limit approach in the lead up to a general election. An election that, when it's not fixed, only the Premier and whoever he chooses to let in on his secret about when that election will be can benefit from. And I say again, who was left out in that equation? It is the voters themselves. That is the violation of a pretty fundamental principle. And so in our Modernizing Government Act, we matched up these very fixed, specific limits on third-party advertising. You must register $500 or more, and you must register no more than 1 1/3% of the limit for registered political parties themselves. You must disclose the special interest that is doing the advertising. Those are the province-wide limits, and then similar limits in each and every constituency themselves. We match those up with fixed election dates so that Nova Scotians have clarity about when their elections are, on an equal footing with the governing party, so that Nova Scotians know before and during an election who is trying to influence their vote, whether it is a corporation or a union or some other special interest, so that Nova Scotians will hear primarily and majority exclusively from their own party and from their own candidates, from those whose names are on the ballots that they have to mark an X on. This is not to get an advantage or a disadvantage for any one particular party, because those rules will apply to all. But what it will do is ensure that the great debate that should happen at election time is done under the shining light of day, with full and fair disclosure, at a time that everyone knows it's going to happen, all towards that greater goal of reducing cynicism about our process and ensuring Nova Scotians get all the information they need to cast the best vote that they can. And then we'll all live with those results. That's what needs to happen, Madam Speaker. So we're looking forward to whatever amendments the government is now, I'm sure, busily at some office here drafting to make real this weekend revelation that they apparently had. I just hope they'll take a look at the very real fixed solutions that we proposed on April 1st in the Modernizing Government Act. An act, I might point out, we actually called for debate in this legislature a week ago Wednesday, that all three parties spoke to, where we actually raised these points. Madam Speaker, you may remember that on the government side, the government provided a speaker to the Modernizing Government Act that talked about everything but the Modernizing Government Act. What a great lost opportunity that was. We could have had a real debate about third-party limits then, and fixed election dates, and all the things that would bring our Elections Act up to a real, modern, dynamic, 21st century Nova Scotia governing process. But that opportunity was lost. Perhaps if the senior officials of government on that side had spent as much time on our actual provisions of the Modernizing Government Act as they did in drafting the speech for that day, they would be in a better place today than explaining the great oops of this bill that accidentally or not left out an important part of modernizing the Elections Act. So, Madam Speaker, I know my time is coming to a close momentarily. I hear the groans of disappointment from the other side of the House when I say that. But in all seriousness, so I don't think I do actually. In all seriousness, if we take a principles-based approach to important institutions like the electoral office, like the House of Assembly itself, like the franchise of election, if we hold true to the basic principle that it was Nova Scotians in this chamber who started modernizing democracy in our part of the world all those years ago, and set as our goal to hold true to that and do our bit in our time, to hold that great democratic tradition in trust in 2011, and bring forward an Elections Act that actually does modernize our systems of elections, one that all parties could proudly support, without looking to cherry-pick advantageous provisions and ignoring others. That would be a great accomplishment. That would be something that truly would reduce cynicism in our province. That would be something that would be worthy of our time here in this chamber. That would be something that wouldn't require a weekend revelation to fix. That would be a bill that a minister sponsoring it wouldn't need to come in to the House on a Monday, having introduced it on a Friday, and say, oops, I just realized I forgot something.
I just read it.
Or worse, I didn't really read the report that my bill was drawn from until after I had introduced the bill for second reading. Going back to where I started, Mr. Kane's grade 5 class, which went through that great exercise in conjunction with the federal election, where those kids, 11 years old, they did their homework. before they voted. They would be very disappointed to know that their own government here in this chamber doesn't even do that same level of homework before it proposes to introduce an Elections Act. But as I mentioned a moment ago, Madam Speaker, I would like to take the minister and the government at its word that it did just forget about this part, or it didn't read far enough into the report to get to that part. Even though they only had to read as far as page 6, and even though their copy of the Elections Act is an appendix to the report itself. But I would like to take them at their word on that, because the alternative is so much worse. That they did in fact read the entire report, that they did in fact see the recommendations on third-party advertising, that they did in fact do their homework and think it through. But they were so absorbed by their own self-interest in this area that they chose to leave it out of the bill. That is a far worse conclusion even than the oops. And I sure hope that when those amendments come forward, that they will satisfy all of us that it was just an oops, as bad as that is, and that it wasn't something far worse, which would be a deliberate attempt to leave the field wide open in this area. But I have to say, Madam Speaker, that we're not confident that that's what's going to happen when we see the amendments. Because unfortunately for this government, past behavior suggests otherwise. Much like other bills that have come to this House where the government claims to have done all its consultation, where it claims to have done its homework, only to find that that is not the case, this looks like part of a pattern. In the last session, in Bill 100, where the government brought in a bill that looked pretty innocent on the surface, that claimed to be aimed only at a high-minded principle of improving labor management relations in our province, that claimed to be a simple administrative matter, that claimed that all of the relevant parties had been consulted, got introduced in this House, and only a few days after introduction, kaboom. We were descended upon by many, many, many interested Nova Scotians who were in shock at what was being proposed because they had not been consulted, because their interests had been ignored, because the government was proposing to put in important committees like a Labor Management Review Committee to make sweeping recommendations to the Labor Code that would leave out 70% of the employers of the province. That is our experience when it comes to innocent-looking bills. Or even in this session with Bill 17, where the government brought in a bill that purported to have a high-minded principle, where the government claimed to have done its homework, where the government claimed that it consulted with affected parties, only to find out again, after just a few short days of introduction, that a whole group of people were in shock at what the government was proposing. Bill 17, of course, deals with pharmacies themselves. And yet, who is the most upset? Pharmacists. Now, who would you think the government would consult before bringing in the bill? Pharmacists. And yet they're lined up over in the other place in law amendments, one after another, describing I'm setting an important pattern of behavior here that's very relevant to this bill.
Should have been paying attention over there.
My point being, Madam Speaker, that this is a pattern of behavior that continues into this bill which I am speaking about at this very moment, which again comes out after extensive consultation that doesn't do everything it's supposed to do. And now we're here to pick up the pieces yet again, to hold the government to account for what it has failed to do yet again, to defend important principles of democracy that the government is ignoring yet again. Well, we'll continue to do that, Madam Speaker. We'll continue to do our job on this side of the House to defend those important principles, because left to their own devices, the government is obviously intent to continue to manipulate the electoral process to their own advantage. It continues to bring in bill after bill with these provisions in it, or left out or omitted deliberately in the hopes that no one will notice. Well, Madam Speaker, Nova Scotians, whether they're opposition members of the legislature, whether they're interested parties, or even whether they're voters generally, are on to this pattern of behavior and are saying no. That's really why the government has had this weekend conversion, is because they've been called out yet again on this despicable pattern of behavior. And that's why we continue to hope, like Charlie Brown in that football, that each time they say they're going to do better, we continue to hope that they will do better. Well, we're not running up to kick that football quite yet this time, Madam Speaker, because now we need to see proof. So the government has an opportunity. This is their great test on the amendments that are going to come forward, that they better meet this test, that they better meet the test of principle, that they better provide real, meaningful reform in the area of third-party advertising, like was called for in the report, like we gave them in the Modernizing Government Act. That is the threshold that they now need to meet before we're going to run up and take another kick at that football. And so with those few brief remarks, Madam Speaker, I will take my place and await with great interest what is coming forward next from this government.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to the member for Pictou West just asked if I want to adjourn debate. I'd love to, but I think that the government House Leader would probably get a little bit upset, a bit touchy about that if I did that for the evening. So I'll avoid that. See, look at that, Madam Speaker. See, the government Deputy House Leader is already trying to stage a coup over there on the against the government House Leader on this. I appreciate it. So, Madam Speaker, I am pleased to rise and speak about this bill. There's a there's a number of issues that I wanted to speak to related to this bill, including electronic voting and some of the other issues. I will start, however, with the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room, of course, being the issue of third-party advertising. And I guess the reason I want to speak to it is because I happened to be outside the chamber and heard the Minister of Justice's comments to the media when he said this had never occurred to him. He had never thought about this until Friday. Well, that troubles me because I'd like to quote from Hansard in November 2009 when the leader of the official opposition, the member for Annapolis, asked the Premier about this very issue, and the Premier said, and I quote, "When the Electoral Commission considers it, comes forward with a set of recommendations, once the Commission has an opportunity to consider it, we'll be happy to have a look at it." Well, that was November 9th, 2009, and so clearly, November 3rd, 2009, and so clearly the Minister of Justice heard about it then. He heard the the Chief Electoral Officer talk about it then, and since that time, that particular officer of the legislature has spoken about it in media reports, and so for the Justice Minister to walk outside and say that for the Justice Minister to then stand and walk outside and say that, well, it never occurred to him until Friday, is troubling to me, because this is an issue that's been talked about now for the better part of 2 years. It's been talked about in editorials in the news. It's been talked about in question period. It's been brought up by the Chief Electoral Officer. It also bothers me that he said that unanimous resolution of the House. Every member of this House voted for a resolution that asked the Chief Electoral Officer to go forward, write a report, and come back with a draft act, which that officer did. And that was her recommendations. And yet the Minister of Justice stood outside and told the media that he didn't even wait to read this report or see her recommendations before drafting his own act. I think we should all be troubled by that, because we all members of this legislature, 52 members of this legislature, voted for a resolution that the government brought forward asking that officer to go and do this work. And yet then the government ignored it and wrote their own. What should have happened, the chief electoral officer should have tabled her report as through the Minister of Justice, as was done. And then after that, the minister should have had his staff go and compile the act, which is what was committed to back after in that resolution early on. But he stood outside and he admitted that he didn't even read it before they put this together. He didn't even look at her recommendations. Well, that wasn't what we agreed to. That wasn't the point of the government resolution that we all unanimously supported at the time when a new Elections Act was promised and the chief electoral officer came forward and did that. That is not what was promised. That is not what was committed to. And fine, the government may choose to not agree with some of her recommendations. That's well within the rights of the government, of course. But to not even review that advice that was asked for and sought, that's very troubling indeed, Madam Speaker. It's no less troubling than the fact the minister is standing outside and saying, well, the first he even thought about this issue was Friday, when it was discussed in question period and elsewhere since that time. It's nothing but disingenuous. Madam Speaker, if the minister had waited for the recommendations in the chief electoral officer's report, which has already been tabled in the House, so I don't think I have to table it again, but I'd like to quote her. She, on page 6, the chief electoral officer says, electoral finance regimes in a number of Canadian jurisdictions have evolved beyond the basic rules governing election spending and contribution disclosure requirement. That trend has been towards the introduction of contribution limits, contributor eligibility rules, and public financing. She goes on to say that on the next page, page 7, the Chief Electoral Officer recommends that inclusion in the Elections Act of a moderate model of regulation of third-party participation in election campaigns. Well, that makes sense. And this is absolutely not the only jurisdiction that is dealing with this issue. It's not, even for that matter, Canada is not the only jurisdiction that's dealing with this. The leader of the third party talked about some of the previous campaigns in Canada, but I think anybody who follows U.S. politics has watched the issue around the U.S. Supreme Court ruling there, where their existing legislation around third party advertising was in fact struck out. And it was struck out by a challenge by a group called Citizens United, which, if I understand correctly, was actually a business lobby group. It was if you want to put right and left wing, it was a right-wing business lobby group. There, in a recent Senate race in the U.S., quite a bit of money was actually spent in a recent Senate race in Colorado, $9.4 million was spent in one race. $9.4 million by third-party advertisers who didn't have to disclose who they were. And 80% of that went to, in that case, to support the Republican candidates. Madam Speaker, the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island may one day actually be able to stand up and say something on the record, but that would, I guess, take making it to the front benches. So
Order, please. I recognize the honourable member for Halifax Sable Island.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's just a simple question of whether or not the member from Dartmouth East was now speaking against his own resolution.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East to carry on with his comments on. Let's stay with the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is I'm definitely on the bill, and Madam Speaker, I will answer the member's question, and I thank him very much for the question. Pretty soon it'll be reversed anyway, so he'll be able to ask lots of questions. But actually 3 days a week.
Order, please. The member from Dartmouth East has the floor in Thank you. And Bill, on second reading on Bill number 59, and if you could continue to speak to the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And on the bill, and actually the member's question is related to the bill. In fact, I'm not speaking against this at all. I'm pointing as to why you need third-party restrictions in an elections bill is so you do not have the extreme examples of what we've seen in the States. The U.S., Madam Speaker, is a perfect example of how bad this can get as it evolves. And I don't think any of us want that. And this isn't about, you know, this isn't about an attack on different groups, because frankly, I'm as equally concerned about a Chamber of Commerce being able to spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in an election as I am about a union being able to do it or any other interest group. It doesn't make any difference to me. What bothers me is the fact that some group who you don't know, and 9 times out of 10 you don't know who the donors are, could spend as much as they want without any limits in any riding, and that's not right. You know. Well, Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, oh, it's too easy. It's too easy. Madam Speaker, there's things that I can say that would be unparliamentary. But let me leave it at the fact that on that issue, the members opposite were very quick to deal with that issue, which couldn't even be spent during elections. And the fact is, but they're not willing to deal with the contributions that went to their own party. So it seems to be a little bit of the pot calling the kettle black there, doesn't it, Madam Speaker? I think the member or the leader of the third party brought up a perfect example of an issue that happened in the last election, which I think that the members opposite wouldn't want to discuss much further. The fact is that during an election campaign, and this is about money which can be spent during an election campaign, you have to have the registration of third parties. And it is absolutely constitutional. In 2004, the Supreme Court ruled in an, to me, ironically titled decision called Harper versus Canada, that these were absolutely constitutional, because at the time, Stephen Harper, who I believe was, when the case was launched, I think he was leader of the National Citizens Coalition or some group like that, and he wanted those rules struck down. He wanted third parties to be able to spend whatever they want. And there were laws limiting that, and now they have to register, and they're limited to what they can spend. And if you look at the 2008 federal election, which followed rules which we suggest here, and which, you know, we're hearing talk that maybe that's going to be amended now and come. You just need to look, and I'll table this list in a second, Madam Speaker. You need to look at the different groups that are there to understand that there is a wide variety. You know, you have the Canadian Shooting Sports Association, the Citizens Against a Carbon Tax, which I assume was a group set up to against Stéphane Dion at the time. You have Friends, I love this one, Friends of the Conservatives is a third-party a registered third-party advertising. Hey, I didn't say there were a lot of members in that group. But you know, the tourism industry, think groups like that.
Order, please. The chatter's getting a little high. It's difficult to hear the speaker. The honourable member for Dartmouth East continues to have the floor.
Sort of. But there's other groups, you know, Make Poverty History and so forth. But the point is, it puts the federal legislation on third-party advertising puts all of these groups, whether they are well-financed groups, and there's no question that some of them on this list are well-financed groups, and others that are less well-financed groups, on an even playing field in terms of what they can spend. And I'll table that list because I did quote from it. And that's all we're suggesting here. Now, in fairness, Madam Speaker, despite the error of that not being in this bill, we hear rumblings that maybe now it's going to be included before it moves on to, or at law amendments, but we'll see those that wording before it hits law amendments. And that's encouraging news. It's absolutely encouraging news, and I give the Minister of Justice and his cabinet colleagues credit for listening to that discussion since Friday. I don't understand why it wasn't included in the very beginning, but you know, I don't take away from the fact that they're now looking at including that. Now, the wording will be very critical. We're told that it may, and may is always that sort of caveat word there, but may mirror the federal rules. And if it does, and it prorates it to the size of constituencies, that could work. But of course, if we end up with the same rules and the same spending limits per constituency that they have federally, then of course, you know, that would be almost having no limit at all based on the geographic sizes. So it's unfortunate that the minister did not have the wording of that here, and you've heard other members say that already today, that we await those wordings, that wording and that specific wording before we move on to law amendments. Because it really gets into the details of how will a third party be defined. And these are issues that Elections Canada struggled with at the time as well. How will they be defined? What will the limits be? One of the ones that they spent quite a bit of time struggling with is how are communications defined, which is an ever more challenging issue in this day and age. It's something that would be worth, that we wish we could be debating the merits of specific wording right now at this stage of, and whether that wording works. But instead what we're here, we have to discuss something that is a potential that may come, that we may hear about tomorrow or may hear about Wednesday. And so we sit here and we wait, and we can only debate the theoretical possibilities of what the government may bring forward in terms of an amendment, without knowing whether the minister stood up and, to his credit, said that they would be open to further amendments. But until we see what it is that the government is proposing, it's very difficult to make any further suggestions based on that. It's worth also noting that a member of a representative of the government called our caucus, and I assume probably called the Progressive Conservative caucus as well, earlier last week when they were trying to schedule a briefing on this and said, are there amendments or things you'll be looking for? You know, and we said, well, obviously we'll be looking for provisions on third party. Perhaps the Progressive Conservatives said the same thing, and yet the minister still stands up and says, well, I never heard about it till Friday, when, you know, not only was it in question period as early as November 3rd, 2009, but it also ends up appearing in communications directly to the government. When the government solicited those comments, it makes absolutely no sense, the comments by the minister in that regard. I think, Madam Speaker, it's important to also it's important to also compare this to the registration of lobbyists, because the government brought forward a bill that was supported by all parties, changing the way that lobbyists are dealt with in Nova Scotia and the registration of lobbyists. And in many respects, a third-party advertiser is a lobbyist. You know, they're lobbying for a particular position or a candidate or an issue. Very often they're single issue focused, although not always, but very often. If you look at the ones that have, if you look at the ones that were registered federally, many of those are on a specific issue, whether it's the environment, or the leader of the Progressive Conservatives had mentioned in the free trade election, specifically on free trade, and other issues didn't matter. There's ones that registered on poverty issues. And so it's important to know what their mandate is, what they're seeking, and of course, just like a political party does, they have to report their expenditures afterwards. And I think that just makes sense. It's about fairness in elections. It's about knowing who is spending what kind of money and what they're doing with that money. And knowing why that is, because is it right to get something in the mail or see an advertisement in the newspaper promoting a certain position without, especially during an election period, without that organization or that individual indicating who they are or who they're on behalf of? No, it's not right. It's why we have those rules for political parties. It's why those rules exist. It's to ensure that there's fairness. You know, elections have come a long way in Canada and around the world, and we see, including many members of this legislature who have participated in election monitoring in other countries, and ensuring fairness in elections should be something, and I think it probably is something that we all want to see. We don't want to see any election be unfair. We don't want to see, we want to see as few questions about elections. We want to see that the public feels their elections are being fair, and that's absolutely critical. Now, there are one of the biggest shames about this is that the government has introduced a new Elections Act, and the Minister of Justice is right. It's the first one in, I don't remember how many years he said. I think he said 22 years, but I could be mistaken. But in a number of years, it's the first major revision of the Elections Act. That's important. That's extremely important. And it's the absence of dealing with this issue in this draft, the absence of having the wording before us today that actually takes away from some of the other issues in the Act. And I'd like to spend some time talking about some of the other issues, some of the other items that the electoral officer recommended and some of the things that are actually in the Act, because there are some important elements, and I think it's worthy of consideration. Section 29 of the proposed Act talks about Election Day. And we've had, I don't know how long we've had elections on Tuesdays, but they've been on Tuesdays as long as I can remember. And one of the things that the electoral officer recommended was that the day of the election actually not be necessarily set on a Tuesday. They looked at the issue that maybe it should be a Saturday. Municipal elections in Nova Scotia are on Saturdays. Federal elections are Mondays. I'm not sure what the right day, maybe in this day and age, there may not be a right day. Back in the day when Tuesday was set, or perhaps even when Monday was set, I venture to guess that most people worked Monday to Friday. Most people probably worked 9 to 5, you know, but there are many fewer people, a much smaller percentage of our population now works regular Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 jobs. And that's fair, and so, but maybe Tuesday doesn't make any sense anymore. Now, the government appears to have accepted one of the recommendations, which is this issue of a continuous poll. And the interesting thing about accepting the wording of a continuous poll is the Minister of Justice said that he hadn't seen or read the Chief Electoral's recommendations, and yet he has almost the officer's exact wording in his act on the issue of continuous poll. And I just can't imagine that two people working in two different offices came up with exactly the same wording without the other one seeing it. But let's accept that he hadn't seen the recommendations or reviewed them, because that's his reason for not including. He said he hadn't seen any of it, and that was his reason for not including the issue of a third-party advertising. But that starts to deal with that issue. And it deals with the issue that if anybody looked at the recent federal election, if you had not voted or applied for a mail-in ballot before April 22nd, and you didn't vote in the advance poll, and then something happened, you got sick, you had to go away, whatever, there would have been no way for you to vote if you weren't going to be there on Election Day. And that's because the federal rules still actually require that you either apply for a mail-in ballot by April 22nd, it was however many days before the election, 10 days, I guess, or in the alternative, that you vote at the returning office before that 10-day period. Now, this is an important change, and I think it's a very good change in this Elections Act, that it would allow a continuous poll where you could actually go and vote at the returning office at any time. So if something happened, something happens in the family, that would allow you to go the day before the election or 2 days before the election in a period where there's no advance poll or regular voting day and vote. That's important. We need to, at a time when voter turnout generally is on the decline, although it has been up and down, we need to work very hard to improve that. And making it easy to vote is one of the things that we can do as a tool in that respect. I also think it's important that the addition of allowing younger people to work in polls and be more involved in the electoral process also makes more sense. I think that that's a step in the right direction. I think engaging people at that age, it gives them a sense of ownership in the electoral process that hopefully will translate into something later on in life where they will continue to vote. I may be wrong in this, but I think that if people vote when they're 19, 20, 21, that they continue to vote generally through their whole life. I think the problem is that when people don't vote when they're younger, then they're less likely to vote later on because they don't think that it matters. And they don't recognize it as a responsibility as much as it is a right. There are, of course, other jurisdictions around the world which, and I'm not necessarily advocating for this, but there's other jurisdictions that have dealt with this in different ways, such as Australia, where they've made it the law to vote. And in their recent election, they had a 93% turnout, and that 7% that didn't vote were primarily people that shouldn't have been on the voters list, or there's all kinds of little issues that you can imagine. And they always end up with half a dozen people that get fined. You know, we don't want to have to go in that direction, obviously, and I'm not even necessarily sure that we could at this level. But you know, there are countries, and I don't believe that Australia is the only one that has done that, but there are countries that have, at least one, that have gone in the direction of mandatory voting. But that is like the big hand of that could be like the big hand of government coming down and telling you what to do, which may upset more people again. So what you really want to do, I think, is make it easier for people to vote and really make them part of that electoral process. And I think that I believe the Act moves it to 16 or 17 where you can actually be involved in as poll clerks and things like that. That makes a lot of sense. It gives that understanding of how the political process works. Many of us have had students of various ages here at the legislature for tours or to see the legislature in session. And I always find it amazing. There's a grade 5-6 class that generally every May or June I end up taking on a tour of the legislature, and it's amazing to see them when they're in here, and the clerk will the clerk or the sergeant at arms will bring out the mace, and you know, they'll get to see it, and you know, they all want their picture in the speaker's chair, and they all want to be, you know, sitting in one of the chairs somewhere and, you know, pretend they're doing it, and they get really excited about it. And it's a shame that somehow we lose that enthusiasm that's possible in these kids that are 10, 11, and 12 years old, and we seem to, I don't know, we beat it out of them as the years go on. And I mean, you can get, I'm sure that there are 52 people in the legislature, there are 51 at the moment, I guess, but there are probably 51 different reasons, there are probably that many different ideas on why people become disillusioned in the political process, or why they, the member for Pictou West said it might be watching Leg TV, and he might be right, but it actually, but there's an interesting point when we talk about how the Elections Act and getting people involved. It amazes me, it never ceases to amaze me how many people actually do watch Leg TV. And it amazes me because, you know, and I'm sure we've all had this experience where somebody will call us after having seen something, or, you know, we said something and they just had a question about it, or they wanted to comment on it. And it amazes me that, you know, there's a group of people who, and I have no idea how large it is, but there's a group of people who are engaged enough that they will not only vote and get involved, but they will watch it on TV, or they'll go online and read it, or they'll go read the Hansard and that. And you know, that is, so we can get that group of people who are immensely involved, or people who are involved in the political process, knocking on doors for, you know, whether it's NDP or Tory or Liberal or an independent candidate or a Green Party. You know, can't remember all the parties that ran in the last election, but the thing is that there is a group of people that will get that involved, and yet there's a very large segment of the population that feels completely out of touch with what's going on and completely aloof, and I don't think that's a good thing. I really don't. I don't believe that, you know, frankly, at the end of the day, I'd much rather see people involved, regardless of their political leanings or regardless of whether they support anybody. I would rather see those people involved so that you have an informed society and a society that actually cares about what's going on at their city hall or in Ottawa or in Halifax at the legislature on a regular basis, because it is important, and somehow we haven't made the connection on a lot of issues, and I think we all deserve the blame for some of this, is that we haven't quite made the connection between what happens here and how that changes life, sometimes in very small ways, and sometimes in larger ways. We haven't made that connection, regardless of whether it's a policy that we agree with or disagree. We haven't made that connection, and I think that's one of the keys to improving the voter turnout, is really getting to the point where people understand that and feel that they're a part of that process. And when we talk about people watching it on Lud TV, I have no idea what the audience is for that sort of thing, but I know that the Eastlink, Madam Speaker, you'll recall this, that Eastlink, of course, covers some of the municipal councils, and the HRM Council for a while, I don't know if they still did, was second in ratings, second only to the Mooseheads games. And you know, you look now, they have a lot more shows, and I don't know whether I'm sure the other shows must be better now, but you know, you got to figure that there are people who are interested enough to know what's going on, that there must be a way to get them engaged. And so when we look at these issues of, you know, I'd be interested to know from the minister, when the elections officer made the recommendation that the Act should give the officer the flexibility of the day of the week, to consider the day of the week, then maybe we should be, you know, why wasn't that flexibility in here? You know, obviously the office, this is like, Madam Speaker, it's like a question period from the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island. But so I'll answer his question. He wants to know what day I think it should be. And the elections officer just asked for the flexibility to consider different days in the future, and that's all I'm saying, is I'm just wondering why. So there is no particular day that... Madam Speaker, the Chief Electoral Officer asked for, Madam Speaker, if the member had actually been listening to what I was saying, he would know that I wasn't advocating for a change in day. I was advocating for what the Chief Electoral Officer asked for, which was a flexibility in the dates, should it be more appropriate. It's very likely, interestingly enough, it's very likely that a Saturday wouldn't be the best day, because of course that would be the Jewish Sabbath. Likewise, if you look at, you know, other days may not be the best either, but you can look at things like, you know, the Chief Electoral Officer made that recommendation because that officer of the province felt that it was legitimate to be looking at that issue and legitimate to be having that flexibility. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to leave it at Tuesday. What I'm saying is, and this was exactly what I asked, if the member had been listening, is that I'd be interested to know from the minister why it was decided that that flexibility shouldn't be there. I didn't saying that it's wrong to take that one out. I'm asking because obviously the minister has an opinion, and I'd like to know why he felt in a certain way. The other thing that's interesting here, and there does seem to be some flexibility, is around the issue of pilots and voting trials. And I think that if we were not so concerned, and if we were not facing a situation where we are in the absence of having information on the issue of the third-party advertising and how that will be worded, because I think that that's critical. The wording is very important. One of the other issues that we should be looking at is how these pilot projects would work. Because I think there's a number of opportunities, and many people have talked about the obvious one, which is e-voting. And we know that e-voting has been done in a number of municipalities in Nova Scotia. It's been done in, I think, maybe all the municipalities in Ontario. I'm not quite sure whether it's all of them or almost all of them. It's now being done through some of the federal elections in Asia. And a lot of those, in fact, arguably the leading company in the world is actually a Nova Scotia company that's doing that. And so I am pleased to see that there are provisions for a pilot there. My personal bias is I would have liked to have seen it go further, and that's strictly a personal bias, because I think that the easier you make it for people to vote, the better it becomes. And I know that, and I do recognize and I entirely respect the fact that there are people that are concerned about the security of e-voting. I absolutely respect that view. My personal opinion is that it is no more or less susceptible to that than the paper system, and there are plenty of examples of how that's been an issue in certain areas, not only in Canada but elsewhere. And there are plenty of examples of how the e-voting system has worked effectively, and one only needs to look at examples in various parts of Nova Scotia in municipal elections, or in Ontario in municipal elections, where making it easier for people to vote has worked very well. Not least of which is the fact that if you were in Halifax on voting day because you're at work, I mean, we talk in this act about the fact that you get 3 hours to be away from work. You actually remove the need for that in many cases if somebody wishes to vote in that manner. It also, the issue I talked about earlier, which the government did include in the act, is continuous polling. In the last municipal by-election in HRM, what they did was they actually had they had the regular paper advance poll and general election day, but they had continuous e-voting from advance poll day until election day. And that proved to be very successful, very popular, and interestingly, very popular across a wide variety of demographics. Does it mean, I think it was Windsor that actually did voting by text message, which I think maybe goes a little bit too far. But you know, you can see where the possibilities of this come in the future. And I think that it opens the doors to things like a participatory democracy, or more participatory democracy, where you have things like more opportunity for referenda or plebiscites on issues, where you don't have to mobilize on an issue like that an entire paper ballot system and polling stations. You obviously still need to do that, at least in the foreseeable future, for a general election, even with e-voting, but not necessarily on some of those other, especially on a plebiscite where it's a non-binding issue. It provides you some options to look at. And I think that it's my hope that, you know, we see that the Chief Electoral Officer has been granted the power to do pilots. I'm not entirely sure how those pilots would work, whether when they say a pilot, they mean, you know, a by-election comes up and you would test it there, or what the case may be. I think that's probably the best way to do it, is you try it out in a by-election somewhere. But it does work well, and you know, I'd encourage any member of this House to go over and granted, they're only one company, and there are other, heck, the province might even set up their own system, but I encourage any of them to go over and tour and meet with the folks at IntelliVote in Dartmouth, just to get an idea of how one system works. One system that's been fairly widely used around the world now, successfully without issues. The issues early on, but there have been well, you know, Mr. Speaker, the member for Pictou West suggested a pilot in Dartmouth East. That's what? He's east of Pictou East. All right. Well, how about pilot in all easts, all ridings that end in east? You know, it's an issue of sure. I am the members opposite will probably know that I was a proponent of going to that system when I was up the road, and they did go to that system, and they now use it, and it's proved highly successful. It's been widely audited in recent municipal elections in Ontario, and now is actually required to be used in the Ontario municipal elections, and the entire Ontario provincial government is now looking at going that way as well. And actually, I was asked whether voter participation went up, and actually it did. I wish I knew the number, but interestingly enough, in 2004, in the HRM election, which was a paper ballot, they had a plebiscite, of course, on the Sunday shopping issue. The voter turnout in the subsequent election, which only had it in a only had electronic voting for the advance poll, was almost the same as the election without the plebiscite, and then which was unheard of compared to previous non-plebiscite elections. And then the one that they did it in a full by-election was the highest turnout they ever had in a municipal by-election. It was still too low, but it was the highest they've ever actually had for a by-election. So, you know, it does work. I have no idea what the results were comparatively in Ontario, but what they did find was they were able to, I know the voter turnout didn't go down in Ontario, and they were able to reduce the number of advanced polling stations and so forth. I'm not suggesting it's the be-all and end-all. It's not. I'm not suggesting you get rid of the paper ballot. What I'm suggesting is that, you know, we should be doing everything to make it easier. And Mr. Speaker, more importantly, I'm speaking in favor of the fact that the government included the opportunity for the Chief Electoral Officer to do these pilots in this legislation, so that a pilot can actually be done on this and perhaps other issues. And, you know, frankly, as the years go on, we're going to see different issues. We're going to see different opportunities. We're going to see we're going to get to the point one day where you have things like that. It's much easier to put plebiscite questions on an electronic ballot. It's much easier to be able to set up polling stations in a town mall or a central place in town where you can have the computers that allow you to vote, even if the mall is here and the mall is in the center of town and the boundary lines for two ridings go through the middle. It doesn't matter, because when you key in your number, it knows which riding you're from. So it doesn't become an issue of I have to go back to my riding to vote. And that can be an issue in some of the more geographically diverse ridings. And even in ridings where the boundaries are sometimes funny. For example, it's always been an issue in Craigburn Estates in Dartmouth that they actually end up going to vote in Sackville, just because where the boundary ends up coming both federally and provincially, they actually aren't included in the Dartmouth riding, and so their polling station tends to be quite a distance away from them. And in some cases, they've managed to get that changed, but it's the turnout in that poll location is always lower than everywhere else, because they actually have to drive away from anywhere they would be for the day and drive to areas that they wouldn't be on a regular basis. And so, interestingly, when you talk about voter turnout, when that was done municipally, the voter turnout in that poll actually went up because people just voted from home. And those are the kind of things that become a little bit easier to address, because these communities of interest become much more difficult as populations shift and populations change, and so it gets into actually the riding boundaries as well. I think that there is, or there are, excuse me, Madam Speaker, a number of very important things when it comes to issues around modernizing, you know, everything from how do you register a political party to other issues in here, for example, in terms of how we address the issue of identification. And I think we're probably all aware that the issue of identifying somebody at a poll became a major issue in the 2008 federal election. And I think that was shortly after the rules changed federally, and all of a sudden you had to have your driver's license and voter card and all kinds of things that people showed up at the poll, and some people they didn't vote, and I don't know whether that affected voter turnout. It was low, but I mean we've seen it going down for some time. I think that when we look at this, we have to understand that it's about making it's really, to me, about making it clear and about making sure that people understand, not obviously that they understand within that 30 days before the election, but when you talk about identification and how you ensure you're on the voters list and how the enumeration list is correct and how you update it, especially in student residences and things like that, it strikes me that it's better if there's a way, and I think this act does, it certainly provides the tools to do that. It's just a matter of whether the budget will be there to do it, is to get that information out on a regular basis. If it's always in the mind, I know, you fill out your tax form and it says you want to be on the federal voters list, and I know that that certainly brings some awareness for people, at least at a federal level, but I think that we have to, it just has to be second nature in terms of how do I vote? That shouldn't necessarily have to be a question the day that you go to vote. Oh, I know. I mean, the member for the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island said it's the same list. I know that. I'm talking about, and I'm aware of that. I'm talking about the identification that you need when you go to the poll. Is that there is inevitably always confusion with people on what they need and what you need federally, provincially, and municipally is marginally different. And so I think that it's.
Well, you write them down and you stand up then. Take your 10 minutes.
It's like.
You're getting in the way of his speech. Just let him finish.
Mr. Speaker,
Seriously.
Order, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth East has the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think that the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island will find that I haven't said anything that's inaccurate. The last one he tried was the voters list, and I didn't say the voters list was created any different. I wasn't even talking about that. I was talking about the identification and the identification that you require at the polling station and how voters are identified. And my point being that I think it's important that that message get out throughout the period between elections so that people inherently understand how it is that they're on the voters list. If they move, how they ensure that they're on the correct voters list. So if they move to Pictou West or Pictou East, or that they ensure that they get on that voters list. And also when you come into things, and this act deals with the issue of boundary divisions and polling divisions, is when those reviews come up, because inevitably, and I'm sure that many of us, if not all of us, have seen this happen, that it isn't until election day, after polling boundaries change, that people suddenly go, oh my goodness, I didn't know this change. I didn't know that I'm in a different riding. It's not my community of interest, and we've seen a couple of challenges on some of these sorts of things here in Nova Scotia. In fact, there's one before the URB at the moment. It's important that people understand the process as it goes along, so they know how to be on that voters list, so they know what it takes to be on the voters list if they move, so that they know just so it's second nature. When I go to vote, what is it that I need to go to vote? And if I care about, or it's important to me what the polling divisions are, when those reviews happen, how do I get involved and have my say? So that at least somebody's heard. I think we all know that, we all recognize that that's an important issue. One of the things that, when we get back to this issue of, that I started on, which was the third-party advertising, if you look at the list of, Mr. Speaker, there's two members over there who are glad I'm back on third-party advertising. However, the fact is, Bill 59 actually covers every single one of the issues I talked to. The one that it doesn't cover that it should is third-party advertising. So every issue I've been talking about is actually covered in this act. So, Mr. Speaker, if the members would have liked to hear another hour on the issue of third-party advertising and not the other very important issues which is in here, then, that would be, I would have been happy to do that. But I thought spending 20 minutes at the beginning on third-party advertising was quite a bit. But one of the things that I wanted to point out with respect to that is some of when you look at some of those third-party advertisers from the list I tabled from the 2008 federal election, some of that, I would argue their goal was vote suppression. And listen, that isn't a That is not a ideological thing on left wing or right wing or center or anything else. There were organizations that their advertising was intended to suppress the vote of the people that they suppress the vote of those they were working against. And so when those advertisements are able to go out in newspapers or in a flyer, whatever the case may be, or phone or robocalls, which are the the big thing of the past 5 or 6 years, it seems, without those being identified, without those messages and communications being identified as to who they're from, it changes it fundamentally. It changes it fundamentally, and so it changes it. It's like 3 conversations going on behind me that I'm listening to. But if you don't know who those are coming from, I think it changes the message, and that's what regulating third-party advertisers is all about. And it frankly doesn't matter, as I said at the beginning of this, whether it's a corporation or a union or an environmental lobby or the 5 members of the Friends of the Conservatives that were in that group. At the end of the day, it's important to know who are sending out those messages. It's important to know what their goal is. It's important to know, importantly, even who their donors are. Who are the donors to those organizations? There are a lot of issues around third-party advertising, from the amount that's spent to the to how that money is raised, to what the goal of that organization is, what the stated goal, and there's obviously a fundamental difference between organizations as third-party that are set up specifically for elections and those that exist on an ongoing basis, like unions or chambers of commerce or organizations like that. Because so I think that's something that you really have to look at and you have to answer in this third-party advertising issue. So and that's what it has to be. That's how it has to be reported. The fact that the minister would come forward and say that he had never heard about this issue, or that he hadn't considered this issue, or exactly whatever's were until Friday, when it was asked about in question period on November 3rd, 2009, when it was brought up by the Chief Electoral Officer immediately following the last election, when it has been brought up to the government when they called the opposition caucuses and asked whether we would have any input into the bill, when it was brought up at the meetings of the tri-party electoral commission, it is a commission? Thank you. When it was brought up at those meetings, the fact the minister can stand up and say, oh, well, I only heard about it Friday. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, that just strains the bounds of credibility. Because it's fine from my perspective if the minister decided if the minister decided that he wanted to. If the minister decided that he wanted to not include that he didn't believe it, that's fine. That's fine. But to then claim that he hadn't heard about it, that just doesn't make any sense. That, Mr. Speaker, that's what, if he had walked out the door and said, listen, I didn't think it was important, I've changed my mind. Well, fine, great. But to stand that he hadn't thought about it till Friday, makes no sense to me at all. I mean, this caucus has introduced a bill in each one of the sessions to regulate it, yet he hadn't heard about it or thought about it. He sat here in question period when the Premier answered questions about it, yet the minister hadn't thought about it when it's under his portfolio. That doesn't make any sense. And so he's busy cutting the justice budget. And so, Mr. Speaker, then the minister stood up today and he said he wants to pass this bill very quickly. I can't remember his exact words, But he wanted to move this through the process quickly and get this done, and that's great. But we don't have, and he stood up and said, and I'm going to do an amendment in law amendments to deal with that third-party advertising issue. You know, the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island complained that I hadn't talked enough about third-party advertising at the beginning of my remarks. The minister couldn't even tell us what his amendment would do when he stood up and spoke to tell us that everybody should support the bill. Well, you can't support moving the bill forward until you know what the government's already decided there's going to be a change and can't tell us what that change is. But, you know, the fact is, and Mr. Speaker, the government has agreed that there should be a change to third-party advertising, but we don't know what that change could be. You know, you put a third-party advertising limit that says, well, you can spend $1 million per riding. Well, that's not really a third-party advertising limit, is it? You know, and then they say, well, you know, it will probably or may mirror the federal regulations. Well, that's nothing either. We said, well, fine, can you put it in writing and just, even if you can't get the exact wording through council and that, can you just put it in writing so we all have that commitment? No, can't do that at the moment either. Well, the minister stood up here and said that he was going to introduce this. So I'm sure he must know what he's going to introduce or what his intent is. I mean, he stood up in this House and made a commitment to the House that this was going to happen. And so, Mr. Speaker, that is... Well, Mr. Speaker, the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island says that's a good minister listening. A good minister listening would have been actually addressing the issue before now and having it in this bill since it's been brought up so many times. A good minister is not creating policy on the fly and announcing policy that he doesn't even know what it is, and by his own admission doesn't know what it's going to include. That isn't. That isn't. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, we introduced a bill. We introduced a bill on this. On this issue repeatedly, so we know exactly what we would propose on the issue of third-party advertising, and we tabled it right here. As a matter of fact, the exact numbers we have up here had I think it's a $25,000 province-wide limit, and you can read the bill. Mr. Speaker, the bill's in his packet. I do know. And a registration of third-party advertisers. I don't think the member has to worry that I know the bill, because the bill is quite simple, and of course I just let him know what's in that bill. So, and I might add, it's mirrored after legislation which has already passed the constitutional test with the Supreme Court. So, you know, we've actually done the work for the minister. All he had to do was say, well, we'll take that and move it along. There are other issues which could have been addressed in here. You know, the Progressive Conservatives introduced a bill that talked about fixed election dates. You know, that would have certainly merited some discussion, and no doubt it was something that they suggested. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I don't disagree that with the member that the current Prime Minister made a mockery of that bill. But the point is that you still have to be accountable to it when you don't follow that, and it's up to the public to decide whether they care whether you follow it. But the fact is that is something which, in my view, certainly would have merit, just the same as other issues around that have merit, such as the electronic voting that I've talked about, and I'm glad to see that the provisions in the Act would allow for pilots on that issue, just like it has merit to allow younger people to work in polling stations, just like it has merit to have continuous voting, which is in the Act. You know, there are things which are important changes in this Act. There are many things in this Act which you know, deserve to see the light of day, deserve to be passed, and I've said that a number of times. That's the first time that member said "hear, hear," so I appreciate that. There are a number of things, and there's a number of things which, you know, we would have liked to have seen in the Act, which, you know, will evolve over time. There's only one issue that sits there and we see as an absolute glaring omission at this time, and that's the addressing of third-party advertising. There are lots of minor issues, and there may be issues that members on the other side of the House, you know, would like to see end up in there at some point as well. but those can be addressed and dealt with. But this one is a major issue. This is an issue that we are seeing is of increasing concern and will become a bigger issue once as the new donation limits and who can donate to parties, as that all changes, the issue of third-party advertising becomes that much more critical, because once you stop, and we all supported this, stopping corporations and unions from donating to political parties, then both of those groups have an incentive to then spend that money elsewhere. And I want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker, this is not, to me, it might be for some other members, but this is not about, that corporations or unions or some other group is bad. It's just as bad to have, a chamber of commerce spend to buy an election as it is to have any other group to do that. This is not, to me, this is about having clarity about who is spending money in elections. And that's what this comes to. I'm happy to hear the minister say that he's looking at amendments, and I'm very eager to see the wording of those amendments, because, if those amendments do the things that we hope to do and hope to achieve, then I, like the minister, hope to see this act move forward so that the chief electoral, especially so the chief electoral officer becomes an officer of this legislature, just like the Auditor General and others. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I think that
30 seconds.
With Mr. Speaker, with that, I'm happy to leave my last 25 seconds on the table, as I'm sure the member for Argyle is happy to use that. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Argyle.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank everyone for their input tonight. It seems like my children, quite often, when the hours get late, they get a little silly and they get a little hyperactive, and they want to actually do more than they really should be doing. And I know that the member for Halifax Citadel, Sable Island, is getting in that kind of giddy state, and I know that some members back here maybe are getting there as well. So as much as I would like to maybe talk about a few issues that we find are of value within this act, there are a number of issues that we find are omissions in this act that we would like to talk about at another time. Of course, one of them being the omission of the third-party advertising. But seeing that the hour is getting late, I'd like to adjourn debate tonight so we can come back on this one tomorrow. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The motion for adjournment has been made. All those in favour say aye. Those against, motion is carried. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. And tomorrow, after the daily routine and question period, we will be calling bills for second reading. Bill 59, plus bills that are in committee the whole, 1, 7, 13, 19, 21, 25, 27. I wish you to now rise to meet the hour of noon to 8 tomorrow, Mr. Speaker.
The motion for adjournment has been made. All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. We will now rise to sit between the hours of 12 noon and 8 p.m. tomorrow.